Welcome to Like Maria. Today we're going to do Shelley's poem Ozymandias. We're going to look at it in the context of a question, discuss the presentation of power in Ozymandias. So this video is going to be very useful to you if you're studying GCSE and you've got poems in an anthology. It's also very useful for general context on Romanticism and therefore some A-level papers. I'm going to talk about this poem in three sections. I'm going to talk firstly about description of the broken statue in the desert. I'm then going to talk about the power of the sonnet form and the shape of the poem. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the voice of the king himself and some context surrounding the king. So firstly, we need to look at the imagery of broken power that we come across in this poem. The quotations are shattered visage and a vast and trunkless form that lies into the desert. We have shattered and trunkless here. These words describing something that is ruined, something that is broken, and violently broken with shattered. Trunkless implies that the actual body is gone, and that the kind of heart of the being is gone. This word visage refers to somebody's face, and with the statue we could talk about the head. It is a shattered visage. The head and the face are shattered. The image of the king is gone. The image of this statue of the king in the desert is shattered and broken. So here we have an enormous image of a former giant, a colossus we might say. A colossus is a giant statue that has been erected to honour somebody. This is shattered. So we have a very visual image of broken power. Shelley talks about the inspiration for this poem in the first line. He says, "I met a traveller from an antique land." The antique land he is referring to is the world of classical literature. He and his friend Horace Smith were reading a chap called Diodorus, who was writing in the century before Christ. Diodorus describes how he came across this statue in the desert which was broken. And it's thought that Shelley and Horace Smith read this, were discussing this, and decided to have a competition about who could write the best sonnet on this. Now, this in itself is a very romantic thing to do. Romantic poets often saw things. Keats saw the nightingale and decided to write in a big rush of inspiration. And these two poets read this literature. Right, we're going to write a sonnet. Fantastic. They both wrote sonnets. They both published. Horace Smith, no one knows about. Shelley rose to fame, and this indeed is one of his most famous poems. So they both wrote sonnets. Why have we got a sonnet here? Partly, one assumes, because of the competition. That was what they needed to, the form they needed to address. But there are other reasons here. A sonnet is usually a love poem. It's usually written to someone you admire and adore. We know Shakespeare wrote very many sonnets to an unknown person that he admired. And they are usually addressed to the person, and they are in a beautiful language. They admire and praise the person's physical attributes and their character. Here we have words that do not, they're not very praising of this king Ozymandias, or his other name Ramses. So the words such as a shattered visage, but also a wrinkled lip, a frown, and a sneer of cold command. These are all words that do not sit comfortably in a sonnet. They are not words that you would use to describe someone you admired. So there is an irony here in writing a sonnet about this king. Clearly, Shelley is expressing distaste and dislike of this king, and indeed dislike of the power that this king wields. We have that phrase there, cold command, and the harshness of the alliteration there, and this choice of the adjective cold makes us feel very uncomfortable about this king. The sonnet is also split into a octave and a sestet, 8 lines and then 6 lines, and it turns around the volta. Now the volta in a sonnet is like the middle of a seesaw. It is the point at which the sonnet pivots upon, and here it's the line "and on the pedestal." And I would argue that this is particularly designed by Shelley to separate the description of the king and the description of the statue with the pedestal and the declaration of the words on the pedestal. So here the sonnet is broken in two. The body of the sonnet is detached from the pedestal in the very same way that the body of the king is detached from its pedestal in the desert. So the very form of this poem reflects the brokenness. We also have some half rhyme at the top of this sonnet: land, stone, sand, frown. So stone and frown do not really rhyme, and I would suggest that this is also used to illustrate the brokenness of the king's statue. The sonnet does not run in the traditional way, and the king's statue is broken, just like the rhyme in the sonnet is broken. Lastly, I want to talk about the voice of the king that appears on the pedestal. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. This is a very commanding voice. Look and despair are imperative words. They are directional, they are commanding, they are making a big bold statement of arrogance here. Yet we are reading in Shelley's poem that the king is broken. His realm is no more. It is boundless and bare. There is nothing in the desert. So here we see the irony of these words of arrogance and power being left in a very powerless place, a place that nobody really stumbles across unless you happen to be Shelley reading and listening to an antique traveller. This has come into our modern culture in that any reference to Ozymandias immediately brings to mind the notion of someone who is very arrogant and powerful and then falls from power and is humiliated. We get this in a modern cultural reference in the TV series Breaking Bad, when somebody who is in charge of a whole drug empire crumbles and falls and becomes as nothing. The context of this and why Shelley chose to highlight these issues about power, that's what we're writing about in our essay, Power, is that he was living in the early 19th century and he was under the realm of George III. Now, Shelley considered George III to be a very poor leader and in some ways tyrannical, in that he didn't really care about the people. In fact, he wrote another poem, and this is very useful context for you. The other poem was called England in 1819. And he describes in this poem King George as an old, mad, blind, despised and dying king. So he was not in the habit of praising kings. He was not in the habit of thinking that the hierarchical structures within the politics of the time in the early 19th century were a good thing. And this poem clearly shows his pleasure at demonstrating how powerful men can fall. So I hope you've seen here how we can talk about power and how it is illustrated in Ozymandias.